Welcome everyone to this module that will cover an actual RNAV takeoff and an explanation of the indications on the primary flight display throughout the takeoff roll and initial climb. I'll also include some details associated with a rejected takeoff after auto brake availability and prior to activation. I will intermittently pause the simulation at various points to emphasize the indications and provide a detailed explanation. I will also include some practical professional habits during the takeoff roll. This pause simulation will be followed by a second takeoff without any pausing so that you can have an example of what the actual timing and pace for scans and indications are during an actual takeoff roll. An important note that I want to emphasize, and that emphasis is that different airlines may have different procedures and callouts during a takeoff. There will be no attempt in this module to describe any specific airline procedures during takeoff. What I may add at certain points during the takeoff roll and emphasize certain changes in the annunciator, in the flight mode annunciator, where there may be a call out. Your respective airline will have specific procedures that you can apply to this information, and you'll see that can easily be applied once you embark on specific training with specific procedures. At the start of a takeoff, an airline may have a specific procedure to position the throttles prior to executing the toga switch. In this module, the toga switch will be engaged from the idle throttle position. That may also be a specific action that would be called for by a specific airline. As I've emphasized in all of the takeoff modules here, it's a good discipline to look at the takeoff reference page on the FMC to note the takeoff power and how it should accelerate to the toga position is executed once the toga button is engaged. So look over here on one of the FMCs that has that information displayed and see that it is in the thrust mode annunciator, because that's where you want to see that the throttles are going to go to that setting on your engine indications. Again, something that we've previously emphasized, as you enter the runway, give a scan of all the areas to see that you're ready for takeoff. Most important is this thrust mode annunciator. Make sure that the auto throttles are armed, that the roll mode is in LNAV armed, and that the vertical profile VNAV is armed in the pitch window. See that you have two different nav display scales here. Make it useful information. In this case, we've got the first waypoint that is depicted on the flying pilot side, and over on the pilot monitoring side, we have the second waypoint. Also make sure that your FMCs are giving you as much information as possible. Again, look across cockpits, make sure that the FMCs are set on two appropriate pages for takeoff. Some of the points of emphasis in this lesson. As you enter the runway, rescan those important items and that the setups are complete to initiate the takeoff roll. Know what the PFD indications are going to be once the toga switch is engaged. Continually scan the PFD and appropriately monitoring the engine performance intermittently during the takeoff roll. There should be at least 3 glances at engine instrument indications in these two panels during the takeoff roll in case there's any abnormalities which will be displayed. We'll talk a little bit more detail about that later. You want to notice when the pitch bar appears. You want to notice when the pitch bar moves to the V2 pitch position. Note when throttle hold appears in the auto throttle window during the takeoff roll. I'll explain what that means in terms of a rejected takeoff. Again, the last minute scan of the engine instruments about 5 to 10 knots prior to V1. When you rotate, look to see when RNAV engages. It engages quickly at 50 feet. Then shortly after, as you're raising the gear, you're going to pass 400 feet where VNAV is going to become active. When we hit takeoff, we're going to have, in the auto throttle window, we're going to have TOGA active in the pitch window. And then we're going to notice when we have a change from takeoff mode to climb mode in the FMC, and we'll retract the flaps on schedule and notice when we start to level off at 5,000 feet, which will terminate this module. A note here, after I've engaged the TOGA switch, what we have in the FMA is N1 indication, indicating that the takeoff power has come up to the takeoff position on the N1 indicator. And we also have TOGA reflected in the pitch window. We still have ARM in the LNAV and NAV. Notice too, we have the pitch bar appear. We had the roll bar earlier, but we didn't have the pitch bar. But as soon as we hit TOGA, it appears here in this 10-degree nose low position. That will transition at 60 knots to the V2 position. Note that as we continue this takeoff. Notice how the pitch bar came up at 60 knots. So that's an indication that you want to see. This is a good time to take a scan at the engine instruments as well. Aircraft's performing normally. Next indication we're looking for is throttle hold that you see here in the pitch window, which engages at 84 knots. That's an important indication because what it means is that the pilot has control of the throttles such that he can manually move the throttles forward or back, and it will stay in that position other than what the auto throttles are calling for. So this is an important indication, especially for a rejected takeoff, because when we have this, I can pull those throttles back even without disengaging the auto throttles, and they'll stay in that position. If I didn't disengage the auto throttles without that indication in the window, the throttles would return toward a takeoff position. It's always a good procedure to disconnect the auto throttles when you reject a takeoff, and that's probably going to be the procedure. But the other thing that's important about this is in another couple knots, if anything happens during the takeoff roll where I have to reject the takeoff, at 90 knots, the auto brakes are automatically activated. So when you bring the power back, you're going to get auto brakes. And that's a great function of this aircraft. A pilot cannot outperform the auto brakes. The auto brakes system takes the airplane immediately to a full brake application such that the brakes skid, but they release the anti-skid system to the max braking, and then it just maintains continual braking. If a pilot is attempting to max brake at this point, the braking is going to be intermittent, in and out of skidding, and consequently a longer rejected length of an aborted takeoff. So know your system, know when it's activated, and you can't outperform it. It's an awesome system and it's safe. It keeps the aircraft aligned under all conditions as well. Glance at the engine instruments here just prior to rotation. When you get to V1 and VR, start your rotation and bring the pipper right up here to this pitch bar here. Now at this point, we see that we're climbing. We see that we're 64 feet above the runway below us. And at 50 feet, we got an engagement of LNAV. It went from ARM to active. And that's an important indication that you should look at and know that you have engaged when you're on an RNAV departure. So we see that indication, and both pilots should note that. Both pilots should note everything that we're talking about here, whether you're flying or not. I want you to note here that once we get a positive rate of climb, that'll be a time where you'll go ahead and raise the landing gear. The next thing we're going to look for is when we get a green VNAV, which is going to occur at 400 feet, where VNAV now becomes active. And you should note that here as I release us, and we'll continue on this climb. Trying to do a number of different things here, gang, so I apologize about that. We're coming up on this 400 feet here. The landing gear are now in transit to the up position. We'll climb it just a little bit further, and you'll see that this VNAV is going to become active. And there you can see that we now have VNAV speed. What this is telling us now is that we fly, put it right in the crosshairs, put it right in these crosshairs here, and with the roll bar and the pitch cue, and it's going to fly that pitch to maintain V2 to V2 plus 20 in this particular aircraft. Okay, so this is also a time airlines will have a different requirement for engaging the autopilot. I'm going to engage it here shortly after we were released here, and I want you to notice what the indication is. We've gone from a flight director mode to an autopilot mode, and this nomenclature on the PFD is going to change to command, CMD. So we'll press on. I'm going to engage the autopilot. Notice that once the autopilot is engaged, I have a green light on the mode control panel, horizontal light, but this is what I'm really looking to confirm, that the command mode is reflected on the PFD. This tells me that the autopilot is operating. Now, the other thing that I want to bring up is that generally above 1,000 feet, for most domestic flights, that's when you can start to retract flaps. Now, this little white line over here is the 1,000-foot MSL at the top of this indice here, which means that we can go ahead and start to retract flaps, which we'll do. So we have the landing gear up. Now what we want to do is start to retract the flaps on schedule. Now here's something important about flap retraction. We took off at 5 degrees of flaps. Now what we're looking to do is start the retraction when our speed, our actual speed, is above this white caret on the tape, because that means that we're beyond the min maneuvering speed for the flaps at 5 degrees. And what we can do is call for flaps 1 when we're beyond that indice, as the airplane will accelerate. So we'll go ahead and continue to fly. We're going ahead and retract the flaps on schedule. So we'd call for flaps 1. I see that the flaps now are retracting. I can also see right now that we've gone to the climb mode of the FMC. But what I'm looking at here right now is when we get to 1, you can go ahead and retract the flaps to the up position. So we'll go ahead and do that. Notice that the 1 indice disappears, and now we have a clean wing. The other thing that I really wanted to note here too is that when we had the flaps that were not fully in the up position, was in the 1 position, the speed, it just transitioned on me here, but the speed was restricted to 230 knots because that was a limiting speed for flaps extended to that position. Now that the flaps are up, the speed automatically changes to 250 knots for a clean wing. That's what we have in the FMC here, because below 10,000 feet, that is going to be our limiting speed in most cases domestically. So it automatically made this transition from 230 knots to 250 knots, and now we're going to accelerate to that speed. So we'll continue to fly here. We'll go ahead and turn the auto brake system off, and I'm seeing now that I'm climbing, I'm right on track. Now the other thing to do is always have your heading bug set up for the caret, okay? I'm on the heading knob, but I'm looking at my nav display to set that heading bug up. We're continuing to accelerate. Once we get out of 4,000 feet here, we're going to start to see the transition that knows it's got a level at 5,000 feet. Now, the other thing that I want to point out here, gang, is this. This is most important. I want you to constantly be looking at this altitude arc in every mode of flight. It's going to be really important on approaches and descents. We'll constantly emphasize. But what this is telling me, that green arc is telling me that along my route of flight, at that specific point, that's when I'm going to be level at 5,000 feet. The 5,000 feet that I have set in the mode control panel. That's a very important indication, especially in descents, especially making altitude restrictions. And so I will emphasize that, but I want to start to bring it up at this point. That altitude arc is something very important to constantly monitor as the aircraft is in a climb or in a descent. It only appears there. You're going to see it disappear once we level off. I see that the transition is happening here where we're about to capture the altitude. It went from VNAV speed to the speed being controlled by pitch. Now it's getting ready to level off at that altitude, and now the speed is going to be controlled by the auto throttle and the speed that's called for over here in the FMC below 10,000 feet. So these are all the kind of scans that you should be constantly involved in monitoring and dressing up, for instance, the heading, watching for these indications and transitions. So we'll continue this climb. You'll note that we're about to level at 5,000 feet, 250 knots. Notice the altitude arc is going to disappear here on the nav display. Boom, at 5,000, and it is now no longer displayed on the nav displays. So gang, now we're going to end this here. Just this initial climb and level at 5,000 feet. We'll pick up some more of this for a further climb. We'll end it here. I hope you can see what the indications are, be familiar with them, and we'll make a module here where it's actual full real time up to 5,000 feet so you get an idea of how fast these indications and transitions occur.